What's going on, guys? Welcome back to another episode of our college football rankings. A lot went on last week, so we had a lot of movers this week. Some other big games going on this week, so we'll see a lot of change coming up. A lot that is going on these next few weeks will tell us what we will see at the end of the season. A lot of teams that are close to each other. So, with that being said, we're just going to start off with the 25th spot. And this week, it seems like every week in the 25 spot, I have a new team. This week, I have Wyoming. Some teams fell off, and Wyoming has looked very good this year so far. They're 5-1 so far. They got a win last week. Their only loss was against Texas, which is a pretty good team if you're going to lose to. They beat Fresno State, who was in my 25th spot last week. So since they beat them, I think it's only fair that they get that spot.
For sure. In my 25 spot, I have a team that was hanging around here last week. I have Missouri. Obviously, that game against LSU did not go their way. They collapsed towards the end, but at the end of the day, they're still 5-1 in the SEC. I think they looked good against LSU for 3 quarters. Obviously, couldn't finish it off well, but I still think they're a top 25 team in the country, and I think they deserve a ranking towards the bottom of my list.
Yeah, and I agree. Just like Kirby Smart said, every SEC team should be ranked at the end of the day. Next up at 24, we both have Kansas here. Kansas, overall this year, they've been pretty decent, 5-1. So go especially after last week, coming into both of our rankings. I believe neither of us had them ranked last week, but they've been solid so far. And coming in at the 24 spot, they look good beating UCF. Obviously, they lost to Texas a few weeks ago, but been able to bounce back since then and have a good win.
Yeah, and they've been a good team all year. Their only losses to Texas, who obviously we'll talk about later, that are ranked. And they have Oklahoma State and Oklahoma coming up back to back. Obviously, going to be some tough games there, especially with the Sooners. But with them competing just so well this season so far, I think it's just a respect thing at this point. They've looked good on all cylinders. And I'm not saying that they're going to go and beat Oklahoma in a couple weeks, but we saw Louisville handle Notre Dame, which we'll talk about later. I think if they ride the hot hand, they could go in and, secure a matchup that kind of looks like that.
Yeah. And in my 23 spot, I have Kentucky. They lost to Georgia last week. Not very surprised by that. Like I said last week, kind of how I expected it to go. Devin Leary's all right at quarterback, but the main thing that they did well all season was run the ball, and Georgia knows how to stop the run. Carson Beck had a fantastic game, near 400 yards and 4 touchdowns. That interception wasn't great, but another big game from Brock Bowers, too. Like I say every week, probably the best player in college football. Still a very good team. Still 5-1. Their only loss is to the number one team in the country. So I'm not really going to knock them there. SEC team, so should be ranked.
23, I have Tulane, obviously pretty far off from the SEC team, but this is the team we both had ranked decently high in our preseason polls, and we knocked them out of there once they lost to Ole Miss. But aside from that one game, they've looked like the team that we had ranked in our poll. I would bank that they're going to win out the rest of their season. So maybe I'm projecting a little bit, which I don't like to do. But this Tulane team has looked good on all cylinders. I think Pratt has played well at quarterback, and I'm not seeing a lot of buzz for them to be ranked at this point, but this is a team that we had faith in the beginning and has played their part the way I expected them to. I feel like it's about time to give them some more respect again.
Yeah. And next up, we both have Washington State here, dropping down after that UCLA loss. Both quarterbacks in this game, Cam Ward and Dante Moore on UCLA, didn't really look great. 4 interceptions combined from both of them. I was expecting a little bit more from Cam Ward in this game. They just couldn't really get the passing game going. Only 12 yards rushing, including all of Cam Ward's sacks. So they couldn't get that going. UCLA just was the better team. They got the ball on the ground, 140 yards from Carson Steele. So big game from them overall from this team too. I mean, 2 fumbles lost, 2 interceptions. It's very hard to beat a team when you have 4 turnovers. I don't care who you're playing against. If you give a team that many opportunities, you're just asking to lose. And they're still ranked. They're still a very good team. They still could come back. I know a lot of people on the channel are fans of Cam Ward, like we've seen with our last mock draft. He's still a good quarterback. I think he'll be able to bounce back from this, but a guy who's looking to build up his draft stock, the rest of the season's really going to be a big tell for them because they could still have a very good season if they win out. It will be a little tough, but still a good team.
Yeah, and even after this game, I still think Cam Ward is legit. Don't get me wrong, but we're talking about the whole Washington State squad at this point, and in a Pac-12, you really need to beat UCLA in this game. Don't get me wrong, the Bruins are really solid. We'll talk about them a little bit more later, but Washington State was expected to go in and handle business, and they just didn't do that. The defense allowed too much on the run game, as you mentioned, and as a team effort, it wasn't exactly to the standard I expected them to be at. Obviously, they've impressed both of us enough to keep them in our rankings. But if they were going to complete that Cinderella run that we mentioned they had a chance to go after last week, this game needed to be in the win column, and it just didn't go that way.
Yeah, next up, in the 21, we both have LSU here. Coming back onto your rankings, I've had them ranked last week, but Jaden Daniels got hurt midway through this game, came back, ended the game with 390 total yards on the air and the ground, 4 touchdowns, no turnovers. Malik Neighbors, 150 yards almost, and a touchdown. This team is very good. And like we said before, this team definitely has, I would say, probably the hardest schedule in the country that we've seen this year. They're playing up against ranked teams, it seems like every single week, and front loading their schedule is something we really don't see in college football anymore. A lot of teams like to move it towards the back, maybe have 1 or 2 big games, but it seems like LSU's in a ranked matchup every week. And obviously that can hurt them in the rankings just because if they lose to these teams, they've had a lot of close games. But they came out, beat a very good Mizzou team on the road. Jaden Daniels, one of the best quarterbacks in the country, and we saw that again in the air and on the ground. This LSU team is very good overall. Still could potentially be in the running. I know there's a lot that would have to happen with the shakeup, but they still can have a really good season this year.
Yeah, I mean, I have LSU in the same spot. My only problem with them is that we've seen the season, it's a tale of two teams. Obviously, they're going against really high competition, so I do understand to an extent. But we know their offense is electric. We know Neighbors, Daniels, these are guys that are legit NFL draft prospects and incredible college football players. But when you look at their defense, I'm not seeing the production I expected them to. In our very first video where we talked about college football in our ranking video, our preseason ranking, I should say, I talked about how I expected big things from this defense. Obviously, Harold Perkins in particular is a name that was flying around for NFL draft buzz, but just on-field performance hasn't been good for almost anyone on this LSU defense. So it's been really tough. Obviously, against Missouri, they stepped up in the fourth, which is all that mattered. So I was impressed there. But I think LSU just has too many moving pieces to be that team this season. Going forward, I mean, they still have incredible recruiting classes. It's not like they're out of the equation for a New York Six bowl game this year. I think they'll be in the talk for that. But I'm just not impressed with the full resume of LSU. The reason they come back on my rankings this week, they beat Missouri, who I had ranked. They looked great, you know. So that's what I'm talking about, the tale of two teams. I expect LSU to pick it up, figure it out. I mean, if their defense steps up, anything is possible with Jane Daniels at the end of the day. So I like what the Tigers have going forward. I'm happy they're back on the rankings because I think they're much more than talented to be a top 20 team going forward. So a great win from LSU. I expect big things going forward, but part of me wishes they started their season a little bit stronger so we could be talking about potential playoff spots.
Yeah. And next up, I have Notre Dame in the 20 spot. And as we'll see, I think this is the first week all year that I've had Tennessee higher than you have. But at 20, I have Notre Dame. They lost this week, moving down a good amount for me. This team overall, I still think is good. I know a lot of people say they probably shouldn't be ranked after that loss to Louisville on the road. I could definitely see that. I mean, a 2-loss team overall, and they're still good though. I have LSU up here. Notre Dame still, I think, is probably a little better than LSU. We've just seen more consistent play from them overall. And Louisville, I had them ranked last week. We'll talk about them later. Very big rise for them overall, 6-0. But Notre Dame just couldn't really get it together. This was probably the worst game that we've seen from Sam Hartman in a long time, at least since we've seen at Notre Dame. 3 interceptions. I would say really only 2 of those came at the end of the game when the score was kind of garbage time. But overall, he still did have 3 on the day. One big one, though, in the first half. And overall, he just didn't really look that great. They couldn't get the run game going. Only 44 yards from the team overall. It just wasn't a good performance from them. Louisville was a tough matchup and they couldn't get it done. Jack Plummer on the other end did what he needed to do, only 145 yards and a touchdown, but they ran the ball with Jordan on the ground. Talk about Louisville later, but Notre Dame does drop down for me here. Just I can't really have them that high up as a two-loss team when there's a lot more impressive undefeated one-loss teams ahead of them.
Fair enough. And at 20s Tennessee, they get bumped down a couple spots here because there's teams lower in my rankings that jumps them. Obviously, they had a bye week, couldn't really do anything wrong or right, and they have upcoming matchups against Texas A&M and Alabama. Both teams that can be, kind of wishy-washy this year, but we know they have the talent to compete. So there's going to be big games. They've been marked on their schedule since the beginning of the season. So, as a Tennessee fan, hoping for big things there, but unfortunately, with other teams lower than them playing well this week, they do get jumped.
Yeah. And speaking of other teams, well, talking about Tennessee, like you just said, didn't play. Next week they are going up against Texas A&M, so a very big matchup for them. Texas A&M has been in pretty much every single game that they've played in this year. They've been a very tough matchup for teams. They lost to Miami, they just lost to Alabama, but they're only 2 losses on the season. Besides that, they've looked like one of those classic SEC teams that we see every year, where teams are kind of scared to play against them. It will be in Tennessee, so I think that gives them a little bit of the advantage there, especially in a hostile environment like that. So Tennessee be able to go out and get a big win there for their resume. And overall, it will be a tough game for them, but I guess this game kind of tells what's going to happen for the rest of the Tennessee season. They could move up and have a decent end to the rest of this season, but if they lose this game, season is pretty much over at that point.
For sure. And going to 19 here, I have Duke. They had a bye week. They don't move in my rankings. We talk about this every week. It's an ACC that's competitive. The SEC is competitive. The Pac-12 is competitive. There's a lot of really great divisions right now, or conferences, I should say. And, Duke, they get the week off, but going forward, like most of these teams we're going to talk about in this top 25, have a really tough schedule. I'm really anticipating that matchup against UNC. That's obviously going to be a huge game. So we'll have to see what happens there. Hopefully, Riley Leonard is at good health as well. So Duke's going to stay the same. They have potential to shake up crazily going forward, though.
Yeah. Utah, both in our 18 spots. They didn't play last week. We still don't really know what's going on with that quarterback situation. They'll take on Cal this coming weekend, so should be able to go out there and get a win. But hopefully we end up seeing a confirmation on what's going on in their quarterback room, because this team still has potential to go out there and do good the rest of the season. They're going to take on USC, Oregon, and Washington. And if they can go out there and they get all the pieces together, they could win some of those games. It's going to be very competitive to go towards the end of the season. As of right now, though, without your starting quarterback, I can't really give you the nod in any of those games. But at least against Cal this weekend, they should be able to get a bounce back win.
For sure. And they just take a tiny bump in my rankings because we'll talk about Oregon State later. They jumped up in both of our rankings. It's something minimal, something small, but it boosts their resume just a slight bit for the moment.
Yeah. And next up, also UCLA for both of us here coming into this weekend. It was a big game against Washington State. They were favored, which I was a little surprised about, but we saw why. They ended up getting that big win. The defense looked good. Like I said before, both of the teams not very great in the quarterback department this week, even though I thought both of the quarterbacks were very good. But at the end of the day, Dante Moore and Cam Ward are both guys that I think have the potential to be good, but those turnovers can come back to bite them. And we saw that this week. Guys that are kind of on the edge of being a good college quarterback. I don't know how well they would be in the NFL. And we saw that, but they still got it done on the ground. Carson Steele, 140 yards. Keegan Jones had 2 touchdowns for them. They didn't really throw the ball that much. They did get 300 yards, but it seemed like they ran the ball way more with 53 rushes overall compared to just 22 completions. And they got it done on the ground. That was the big name of the game. They got some fumbles. The defense just played well overall. They got interceptions, and they just look like a very good team. They're in the 17 spot for both of us, and they could make some noise for the rest of this season.
Yeah, and shout out to UCLA. I think for both of us, they've been hanging around the bottom of our list. They've been in, they've been out, and this was a really big game for them, and they showed up. they exposed a part of Washington State's team that, wasn't as good as we may have thought, being the run defense. They ran the ball very efficiently and they ran it over and over again, as you mentioned. They knew the game plan going in. Their defense made big plays, look good on special teams. Just a really great week of football for the Bruins. And with a win like that, if they continue to put the pressure on some of the other teams out west going forward, I mean, this is the team that has a good enough resume and good enough wins that could potentially come forward to be, a top 10, even higher contender on this list. So this was a game they had to win. They went out and did it. And now they're done with hanging around in that 25 spot. They're really looking to fight with the top dogs in college football right now. And I was very impressed with this game for them.
Yeah. And next up, a team that I have here at 16 is Duke. Usually I'm all for having teams who played and having the higher team who beat them above them. But with Notre Dame having 2 losses, Duke having 1 loss, I think that definitely is an exception here. Duke didn't play last weekend too. They are going to go up against NC State this week, and NC State has been very good this year overall. They're 4-2, but another team just like Texas A&M, where they've given a lot of good teams a lot of struggles. And overall, playing their 2 losses this year are against Notre Dame and Louisville. Only lost to Louisville by 3. Notre Dame, they did get beat by a good amount, but they kept it close for a while. Besides that, they've come out and beat some teams. So a good, tough matchup this week. Still kind of waiting to see what happens with Riley Leonard going forward. But Duke, still a good team overall. I think they could still make some waves for the rest of this season in an ACC where it's still very competitive, and with teams like UNC who are still good, but definitely prone to having a hiccup here or there, which I'll talk about a little bit later. We'll see what happens.
Yeah, and at 16, this is where I have Notre Dame. Obviously, they beat Duke a couple weeks ago, and this is probably the highest I would ever put a 2-loss team at this point in the season. But with that being said, their 2 losses are to ranked teams. They have multiple wins over ranked teams as well, and they just didn't look good last week. That's why they take a big dip from me. But overall, I've been pretty high on them. Sam Hartman, I still think is one of the best quarterbacks in college football. You'll see in our Heisman rankings, he's not in the top 5 this week. You really can't put him there after a performance like that. And we'll mention some quarterbacks that had amazing games going forward with some of these higher ranked teams. But with that being said, I still trust Notre Dame. I still think they're really good. It just is that classic Notre Dame thing, though, where they drop a couple games early, and it doesn't really matter how well you finish off the season because you kind of dug yourself into a hole. With that being said, I've still liked what they've done up to this point, except for last week. I'm trying to not talk too much about this Louisville squad that they lost to because I have them coming up right next. But in general, it's a tough blow for Notre Dame. It kind of takes you out of the equation for, a playoff spot unless things really shake up your way. But logistically, I still think they're better than a team like Duke, who they beat. But I can really understand either way. I think your logic makes sense on that end as well.
Yeah, and next up here, Oregon State at the 15 spot. They're going up this week. Tough matchup that we'll see against UCLA. Big Pac-12 matchup. And both of these teams towards the bottom of the Pac-12. And this is the 15th ranked team in the country for me. That just shows how good the Pac-12 is. We'll talk about USC, Oregon, Washington later. But this Oregon State team still solid. There will be a lot of shakeup towards the end of the season with USC, Oregon, and Washington. Everyone's going to play each other. One big matchup this week, Washington and Oregon. So Oregon State, if they can come out and get a win, obviously that loss hurt them a little earlier, but they're still up here. They're still one of the best teams in the country. So they still have a very easy chance to be able to go and get into the championship game, potentially make a playoff push, just because we're going to see all these teams. Even if a team wins out, they still have a good chance to make it in there. So with the Pac-12 kind of being very wide open at this point, Oregon State still has a shot, still a very good team overall. And this UCLA matchup will be very big for them because one of those teams could be knocking on the door of a top 10 spot after this week.
Absolutely. And at 15, this is where I have Louisville. So I'll talk a little bit more about that Notre Dame game. I mean, just a huge win for them. They were ranked 25th. A lot of people didn't have them ranked in general. And that defense stepped up tremendously. I think a lot of the storyline is going to be their offense. And the offense played well, don't get me wrong. But as I mentioned, Sam Hartman's a quarterback who I have, as a borderline top 5 quarterback in college football right now. And they force him into multiple mistakes. Even if some of it was in garbage time, you still have to make the plays. And the Cardinals did that the entire game. They didn't take any plays off. With that being said, I mean, yeah, the secondary played good, but they also sent a ton of pressure. Estime is one of the best running backs in college football for Notre Dame. He was kind of swallowed up for the most part. And Louisville was a team in this competitive ACC that me personally, I wasn't taking as serious as some of the guys I consider top dogs, like UNC, like Duke, even at the start of the year, like Clemson. And they've completely blown my expectations out of the water. They look really, really good. And as I mentioned, ACC is kind of similar to the Pac 12. There's a lot of big matchups towards the end of the season. If the Cardinals can find themselves on top of some of those matchups, I mean, who's to say that they're not really legit? I have them at 15 for a reason. I know you have them around this range for a reason. They are a really good squad. They have playmakers at every position, it feels like. And I like pretty much any team up here. I've loved what I've seen on field from them so far. And that win against Notre Dame really solidifies them as a competitor in college football for me.
Yeah, and I have him at 14 here. Like you said, this defense was great. 5 sacks, 8 tackles for a loss, 3 interceptions, 2 from Devin Neal. And this team looked very solid too. That's just talking about the defense. Offensively, very good. 143 yards, 2 rushing touchdowns from Jordan. Jack Plummer did exactly what he needed to do. And I went and looked back because I thought it was very interesting seeing Louisville this high. And this is the first time that they've been this high since we saw Lamar Jackson there, which is kind of funny to see because that feels like a long time ago, even though when you look at it, Lamar Jackson's been in the league for a little while and just kind of makes you feel old at the end of the day to see that it's been getting closer to 10 years than it's been to 5 years since they've been this high. So funny to see that, but great to see teams kind of coming back and making some waves. Louisville has been very good this season. They're going to be competitive for the rest of the year. They're going up against Pitt this weekend. Then they take on Duke, Miami, and Kentucky to end off this season. So some big games. A lot of those teams will probably be ranked by the time they face them. And with a lot of shakeup that we see towards the top, I mean, if this team wins out, they weren't even, I mean, the past few weeks we've talked about how good these ACC teams are with UNC, Duke, and we didn't really talk about Louisville, but now, I mean, they put their name in there, and if they go out there and they can compete, Florida State's still at the top, but it'll be interesting to see what happens with those two teams. If those are the two teams that make the championship, UNC is obviously still up there. They won't have to play UNC though. So very interesting. They still have a chance to potentially even make the playoffs, which would be even crazier to see. But they'll probably be in the ACC championship. They can continue to win out these games. But for now, highest spot that they've been since 2017.
That's actually crazy. At 14, that's where I have Oregon State. Obviously, I say good things about this team every week. I really like watching them play. And don't let the score fool you on this one. It felt like the Beavers had this one in the bag the entire game. Obviously, DJ threw 5 touchdowns, and I'm going to give you my weekly Damian Martinez update. He got 69 yards and a touchdown. Just an incredible showcase of offense there. I worry about letting up 40 points to Cal. Don't get me wrong. Defense definitely didn't make plays the way I expected them to, but I really have faith in this Oregon State team. I think DJ is still trying to beat the horrible quarterback allegations. He's been wishy-washy at times, but outside of him, to be honest, this Oregon State team is really showing off how consistent they can be week to week. I like them a lot. I think I'm higher on them than most people are. But based on what I've seen strictly off on field production, if these teams, we didn't know who was who and we didn't have any bias, Oregon State is 100% a team that's fighting for a top 10 spot at this point. So a lot of season left to play. As we mentioned, really tough matchups going forward, but I'm a huge fan of theirs and I'm happy to put them at 14.
Yeah. And at 13 here, we both have Ole Miss. Overall, they gave up a good amount of points to Arkansas. Arkansas is not a very good team. They're 2-4. But at the end of the day, they have two guys who are probably day one or day two picks in Raheem Sanders and KJ Jefferson. A lot of people like both of those guys. Raheem Sanders didn't really do much, only 15 yards on 8 carries. He was locked up. But KJ Jefferson had another great game this week. Besides those 2 interceptions that he threw against this Ole Miss team, he had 250 yards and 2 touchdowns. He was hitting Ty Washington out there, had 2 touchdowns to him. This Ole Miss team did let up a little more points than I was hoping that they would. But at the end of the day, the Arkansas team is pretty solid offensively. Their defense isn't that great. Ole Miss's defense looked pretty good despite giving them 20 points, 5 sacks, 10 tackles for loss. They just kind of let them get past on a few plays. And Ole Miss couldn't really get too much going. offensively. Quinshawn Junkins had 65 yards and a touchdown, so another great week from him. But overall, this team's still very solid, still making a push for that SEC championship towards the end of the season.
For sure. And I think we both have similar feelings about Arkansas. Yeah, their record's bad, but I think it's a good team. I was really just looking for Ole Miss to get out of this one without a huge upset scare. It got messy towards the end, but they won the game. They only bounced up a spot in my rankings. It wasn't a necessarily a dominating win, but in a game where Jackson Dart didn't play particularly well, Ole Miss still gets a win over an Arkansas team that I would have been worried about if I was a Rebels fan. So good for Ole Miss. They're obviously one of the better teams in the country, so they did what they had to do, and they're going to hang around this top 10 spot going forward.
Yeah. And for these next 12 spots, we pretty much have the same rankings, except for Florida State and Oklahoma. So we'll talk about that in a little bit. But just starting off at 12, we have UNC here coming off of a win against Syracuse, kind of a bounce back week for them. They got another big win here. Drake May came out, did exactly what he needed to do. He didn't really have some great performances towards the start of the season, but I was looking at this game, a Syracuse team that would be competitive. It clearly wasn't competitive in this game. Drake May, 442 yards and 3 touchdowns. I've kind of been on the edge of one of those guys where Drake May's looked very good in college, but there's been some games where I don't know if his game will translate over to the NFL. This was one of those games where he comes back out kind of when the doubters are coming out, and he got it done. He did exactly what he needed to do and got a lot of good stats, made a lot of good plays. And this will definitely be one of those games that when you're going back and watching film going into this next draft, this will be a game where a lot of his highlights will show up.
100%. And I really like that Syracuse team. I thought they might have been flying under the radar all year. I even mentioned how if UNC's not careful, that could be a game that's on upset watch. But Drake May just did what he had to do, and much more than that. He looked great. And they don't have a ton of movement in my rankings necessarily, but a convincing win like that is nice to see after we've seen UNC struggle a little bit in the last couple of weeks.
Yeah, and they're taking on Miami this week. Neither of us have Miami ranked. Very hard to rank them after the way that they blew that game. If they took a knee, a very different sentiment to the rest of their season, but Miami still going to be a very close game for them. The spread's at 3.5 right now. I still think Miami is a good team, but very hard to rank them after that. Big win for UNC if they can get it done. Next up, though, Alabama, who seems like they're still going to hang on to these rankings. It looked like they were going to be close towards maybe not bouncing off, but towards the end of the list here against Texas A&M. They got it done in the end. Jermaine Burton, who transferred from Georgia, he had probably his best game at Alabama so far in his career, 200 yards and 2 touchdowns. I'm a big fan of him overall. He was great at Georgia, decided to transfer to Alabama, missed out on all those rings. He won't get one this year, but he'll get his stats up and his draft stock up. So good for him at the end of the day. Jalen Milroe got his 3 touchdowns. He looked really good. This was a back and forth game overall. And when we saw that safety, it kind of changed the rest of the game in the fourth quarter for them. It was close. Texas A&M just proved that they weren't really as good as Alabama. When we get these close games, usually the better team can prevail in the end. And Milroe got it done. Still a lot of question marks around this Alabama team, as we'll see. I know a lot of people are throwing them into the SEC championship. And at this point, if they continue to win out, they will be over Ole Miss. But still a lot of question marks for them.
For sure. And kind of similar sentiments there. I've shown many times that I like Jalen Milroe. I think he's a good quarterback, at least up the college level. And I think a game like this is good for him. Obviously, the score is closer than you'd like. The game itself started going in different directions that maybe Crimson Tide fans weren't super big fans of. But at the end of the day, Milroe had a great game. His stats look right. And I'm more and more confident with him being the guy every week. I think Nick Saban probably has a similar sentiment there. Alabama, I mean, they're trying to beat the fraudulent allegations. It's not going super well, but at the end of the day, a win is a win. We'll talk about a team that won a game but looked horrible and maybe slid down some of our rankings coming up soon. That's not really Alabama for me. Texas A&M is a good squad. They come up on top of that, as you mentioned. In games like that, it's usually the better team that ends up winning, especially at the college level. And I think that's what we saw there. I think that's the story of that game for sure.
Yeah, and talking about one of the best games that we've seen this season overall, the Red River rivalry, which is always a shootout every time we see it. back in the days of even Baker Mayfield, when we've seen a lot of great quarterbacks in this rivalry, it looked like Texas went down and got that touchdown to win the game. But Dylan Gabriel, who snuck into our 5th spot in our rankings last week for a Heisman, came out and got it done in the air and on the ground. Talk about him a little bit later. This Texas team still, like I said last week, win or lose for whichever team, I think both of these guys are going to be going against each other in the championship game by the end of this year. I think Texas will be able to win out, especially if they're as good as they have been. Overall, they don't have any ranked matchups for the rest of the season. Houston, BYU, Kansas State, TCU, Texas Tech, they should be able to go out there and wipe all those games. Quinn Ewers had not his best game overall, 2 interceptions, but only 6 incompletions and 2 interceptions out of that. So it was just those 2 mistakes that really hurt them. They ran the ball really well. They passed the ball very well. Xavier Worthy with another 100-yard performance. And this team is still definitely in it. We'll see what happens when they match up again at the end of the season. I'd be very surprised if these aren't the 2 teams in the championship. But if you're Texas looking at this win, Oklahoma beat you. And if they do play at the end of the season, obviously playing in a neutral site this weekend in this rivalry game, but when they play against each other again towards the end of the season, we'll see if they can figure out how to make those mistakes go away. And that win will definitely see who will make a playoff spot. I mean, I'd mark that game right now as potentially maybe the 3 or the 4 seed for the end of the season. Whoever wins that game will definitely get a playoff spot.
For sure. And I mean, as you mentioned, this is probably the best game of college football we've seen all year. It's a rivalry that always runs high, emotions go crazy, and Dylan Gabriel and the Sooners just got the better of Texas. I'll leave some of the Dylan Gabriel Oklahoma talk for when we talk about them. Texas, they just seem to struggle throughout the game finding some of their top weapons. With that being said, I mean, I know Worthy had a great game. I'm a big fan of Xavier Worthy, but A.T. Mitchell just wasn't himself all day, it felt like. I think that was a big story of the game. Obviously, they found success regardless, but that was kind of a big story that I saw there. And Quinn Ewers, I mean, he looked good. He passed the eye test, but when you break down his box score, you rewatch some of those plays, he didn't step up in the way that we may have wanted him to, especially in a game where I don't think either of us made predictions, but I think we both saw Texas coming out with a win in that game. So, well, disappointing on the Longhorns' part, especially after they've been in a playoff spot since they beat Alabama. I mean, that's high praise for a team that I especially have not had the highest expectations for. So it's definitely a tough loss for them. It's a win that probably would have set them in the path to a guaranteed playoff spot. So for Longhorns fans, pretty upsetting. As we'll talk about later, Oklahoma should be very happy and looking forward to their schedule. As you mentioned, I mean, they're in a spot where they might just be a playoff team. So it's something to look out for sure.
Yeah, next up, USC, who dropped for both of us this week. Caleb Williams had 4 touchdowns overall. On the opposite end, Arizona put up 41 points, and they took them to triple overtime, going for those 2-point conversions. Caleb Williams got it done himself in the end, and it was just a very kind of hard game to watch overall. I was expecting USC to be able to come out here and win the game by a good amount. I think a lot of people did, especially with arguably the best quarterback in college football, the #1 prospect as of right now. And the defense, who there's been a lot of question marks around all season, they did not come out there and play very well. We saw 1 interception from them. But besides that, I mean, they put up 5 passing touchdowns on the opposite end. Jacob Cowing for Arizona had 4 touchdowns by himself. They just couldn't stop him overall. And for a team that was, it seems like a top 4 or 5 seed for both of us at the start of the season, and they haven't lost a game, but they've dropped a spot almost every week. It seems like they're on pace to at this spot. It's not a good look.
No, and it's just disappointing. I mean, we saw their defense struggle against Colorado. We obviously saw them struggle against Arizona. And it's really tough because when you have an offense that I have so much faith in, you have, the player I probably have the most faith in all of college football. It's disappointing that you keep sliding down the rankings, especially when I've been trying to vouch for USC all year. The defense is just simply not good. On paper, it's bad. In performance, it's bad. And the numbers are even worse. This Notre Dame matchup coming up is going to show me a whole lot. If they go out and beat Notre Dame, then I'll take back some of the things I've been saying about them, because Notre Dame, whether or not they are falling in our rankings, which they are, they're a legit team, and we both know that. So USC has to mark an X on that game. They really have to go out and perform, because if Notre Dame beats them, I'd almost call that the season, because that would be just back to back to back poor performances from a team that I thought was going to be competing for a title this year. So it's kind of tough. I hate moving teams down after they win. It's my least favorite thing. I try to avoid it at all costs. But when the wins have been looking scary, it seems like every week this season, it's all we can do. So hopefully they bring it back. I think that Notre Dame game is going to be huge for them, as I mentioned. But as of now, I can't be too happy with what I've been seeing from USC.
Yeah, and two teams that we've seen a lot of great things from going up against each other this week. They both had bye weeks. We'll see Washington and Oregon take each other on this week. Bo Nix and Michael Penix. It's going to be a great game overall. I would expect a very big shootout between these two offenses. Overall, like we said, coming off of a bye week, they had enough time to prepare for each other. This is going to be one of the best games that I think we'll see this season. The over-under set at 67. I would go out there and say I would probably throw it close to 100. I wouldn't be surprised if we see a 55 to 50 matchup overall, whatever it is. It is in Washington. I don't think that really matters. At the end of the day, I'm going to take Washington in this game. Michael Penix is my guy. He's my favorite for the Heisman right now. I know he's the odds-on favorite too. He's our favorite for the Heisman. I think he's going to go out here. This is a massive game for both teams overall, and this could potentially be the game that we see one of the Pac-12 teams really separate from everyone else. Pretty much every team on here has been really good, but there's still a lot of question marks around some of their teams. This is definitely the game where you circle on the calendar. Both of these teams have been waiting all year. They get a bye week. Both teams get a bye week before this game. So almost 2 full weeks to prepare for it. It's going to be a great game. I would say probably the best game that we'll see all season. And I'm expecting Washington to come out here with a win, but it will be a very close game. Both of these teams very good offensively. Both don't have the greatest defenses, but I think that will make it even more exciting because we'll see a lot of points, make it a high scoring game overall. But I know you are a fan of this Oregon team, maybe a little more than Washington. So I want to hear what you got to say about it.
Yeah, and I love giving content for the TikTok. But with that being said, I mean, Oregon and Washington, obviously, we have them 8-7. They're two of the best teams in the country. It's going to be a competitive game. I'm smashing that game over. I think it's going to be an absolute shootout. But at the end of the day, I have to trust one of these teams to make a stop at some point. They're not going to be getting touchdowns every drive. It's going to be close to it, but I need a team that can make a stop. I know Michael Penix is the better quarterback. I think Oregon's defense is much better. I'm going to take Oregon. I think it's going to be incredibly close. I do think it's going to be a shootout, but if it comes down to it, one of these teams will have to make at least one stop. I think it's going to be Oregon in a close game. I don't know what the spread is. They might not, I don't even care what it is. I got Oregon money
3.
line. 3. I got Oregon money line. I think they win this game.
Yeah, I mean, a great game that we'll see overall. Both defenses, I think, will definitely have a big game. Braylon Trice, I think, will be a very big X factor for Washington in this game. If he can go out there and get some pressure on Bo Nix, I think that'll definitely help them by a lot. A 3-point spread, it doesn't really matter. I think it's just because Washington's at home. They do predict Oregon to win on the ESPN predictor or whatever, but I think this is one of those games where I've kind of been waiting for it all season. Bo Nix has had this hype. This is one of those games where every year he's played very well. They have one big game a year. It seems like Oregon has a lot of big games this year, but this is definitely the first massive game that they'll have of the season before they go on take on teams like USC later. So we'll see if he's really got it. I got to go with Michael Penix. I've been talking great about him all year, and I think he's in for the win here. But another team that we can talk about, Florida State, who I dropped down a little bit this week just because Oklahoma won. So they're in my 6th spot here. They've still been a solid team overall. And they had, going forward, like we've said every week, they've been one of those teams kind of like USC, just not as questionable, but they've had some wins where I just haven't been as impressed with. I think I'm just more impressed with Oklahoma, which I'll talk about in a second after. They came out, they beat Virginia Tech by a good amount. That doesn't really surprise me at all. like we said before, only beating Clemson in overtime. Clemson's a good team, but still not the best if you're a top 4 team in the country. They barely beat Boston College, and they come out against a Duke team later this year and Miami, who they should beat. I mean, they're penciled in for a playoff spot at this point. If they go out, they win the rest of the season and win the championship for the ACC. But I don't know. There's still definitely some competition towards them. And with these questionable wins, I just got to see a little bit more to keep them ranked a little higher. But I don't know. I give the edge to Oklahoma, especially after that massive win and just with how great their offense is.
For sure. And I'll talk about Oklahoma and Florida State here kind of as a package deal. I have Oklahoma 6, Florida State 5. I know you have them flipped. I know a lot of people have them flipped. For me, that's the toughest neck and neck matchup I could possibly pick. Oklahoma's obviously riding off a win against a team I had ranked in the 4 spot. So a huge win. As I mentioned earlier, Dillon Gabriel just completely stepped up. We had him in our Heisman rankings kind of a week before a lot of people are going to, and he proved us right. He looked exceptional out there. And in my opinion, I just have this Florida State team slightly higher. I've had them higher the whole season, and I don't want it to go under wraps that Florida State just played an incredible game as well. I mean, it's against Virginia Tech. It's not against Texas, but they looked really good, and they got the running game going, which is something I've been looking for throughout the season. Obviously, Jordan Travis wasn't out there, so they had to rely on different aspects to get the ball moving. But they jump a spot, obviously, with Texas going down. This Oklahoma team is really, really good too. Florida State is really good. I think with both of them having some, games going forward, obviously I'd say Florida State has a tougher schedule. It gives potential for one to bunny hop the other pretty easily. But with 5 and 6 here, you could put them either way for me. I think I have a pretty confident top 6 here with those two being in it. So we'll see how the season progresses, who looks more impressive. And it might just come down to quarterback play, which, is something that we talk about a lot, especially at the college level. But they're both right up here for me. If I flipped them, I wouldn't be mad either. I think your ranking it makes sense as well. So very, very close.
Yeah, I just have them above them. I think especially after that Texas win, it may be recency bias, but the top 25 is the definition of recency bias. What have you done for me lately? That's pretty much what we see. The rankings change every week, so it doesn't really matter until the end of the season. But Oklahoma, I think Dillon Gabriel has looked better than Jordan Travis this year. I would say Jordan Travis probably the better prospect overall, but talking about college football right now, Dillon Gabriel is captaining one of the best offenses in college football, one of the highest scoring offenses. And they are still behind Penn State for me. For the rest of our rankings, we have Georgia, and then we have basically the Big Ten East right now between these 3 teams. I have Penn State above Oklahoma. I was going back and forth about it, but I just think Penn State's defense is better than Oklahoma's at the end of the day. Oklahoma's offense is very good, but I would say it's a lot closer between Oklahoma's offense and Penn State's offense than it is between the 2 defenses. Penn State has, I think, the best defense in the country right now. You can throw up Alabama too, Georgia, but I think Penn State has solidified themselves as the best defense in college football. Going up against UMass this weekend, I don't expect Drew Allard to have a massive game because I don't expect him to see any play in the second half. This should be a blowout win, but some good stats for them overall. I think it'll be another big game, but they're going to come out against UMass this week. That's kind of just a stepping stone to build this offense up against Ohio State in 2 weeks. We'll talk about that a little bit more next week, but for now, this Penn State team having the week off, going up against UMass, they want to make sure they figure everything out. I wouldn't be surprised if they throw in some trick plays there just to see how things work, because that Ohio State game, the biggest game of the year for them, and the biggest game of the year up to this point for pretty much all of college football when we see it.
For sure. And I'm going to have Penn State in this 4 spot as well. I just want to stay consistent here. I do think they have the best defense in the country. I've been talking about Bama and Georgia the last couple of weeks as well. I'm pretty confident it's Penn State at this point. And jumping up into a playoff spot is huge for them. As we both know, they still got to take on Michigan. They still got to take on Ohio State. I mean, they have huge games going forward. That is going to be the story of their season. Up till this point, I've loved what I saw in every aspect of the game. Drew R, he has his moments. I'm with you. I don't really expect something big against UMass. I don't think he's going to play. So, play much, I should say. But this Penn State team just is really, really, really good. It's a bye week, so obviously no specific notes from the last game or anything. but I'm not going to sit here and put an Oklahoma team or a Florida State team above them just because I think Penn State is better. Oklahoma now has the better resume, but Penn State has a better resume than Florida State. It's close, in my opinion. They're both up there. So, I mean, with that being said, I think Penn State is deserving of being a top 4 team in the country. There's going to be a lot of shakeup here. I mean, by the end of the season, realistically, they could be 1 or they could be closer to 25. Ton of football left to play. This Penn State team needs to put it all together. That first half offense has been a struggle for them throughout the year. That's something that against a team like UMass, as you mentioned, run some plays, try different guys, try to work out the kinks a little bit. But Nittany Lions are one of the best teams in the country. I'm going to give them the respect they deserve, have them penciled in what would be a playoff spot if the season ended today. But going to be tons of different things going forward that can move them up or down.
Yeah, and I mean, between these two teams, Ohio State and Michigan, it seems like after these big wins from Ohio State, they're really starting to push up. I believe that they're third now in the AP poll overall. They were closer to 10, it seemed like, for most of the season. They were at 6 or 7 at one point, but they got the bigger win this weekend. They beat Maryland, and they did struggle for a little bit. In the first half, it was tied, but they came away big in the second half. McCord and Harrison, that high school dynamic. They've been playing together since high school. They know how to play with each other. Michigan got the win against Minnesota. Minnesota is, I would say, a competitive team, but Maryland, on the edge of rankings for both of us last week. I believe you had them ranked. And they have a good quarterback. Their team was very good overall. I mean, they're one of those teams that if they didn't play Ohio State this week would probably be in my rankings. But they did run into Ohio State. They lost. I still am more impressed with Ohio State than Michigan up to this point. Ohio State with those big wins. And like we say every week, I think the only reason why a lot of people have Michigan up there is because of the preseason rankings. I think Ohio State has a better quarterback play, better receiver play. And for Michigan to have these better running backs, I still think it's neck and neck either way. You can still say that Michigan has the better prospects, but overall, I mean, this Ohio State team's running backs have been very good too. We haven't seen Henderson in a little bit. He's been hurt, but it'll be very close coming towards the end of the season. Obviously, we have Ohio State, Michigan, and Penn State here. These three teams will not all be in the playoffs. I think only one of them probably will be based on all the other teams kind of jumping up right now. But we'll see who comes out as the best in the pack.
Yeah, for sure. I'm not going to harp on the same points that we've been saying every week. Ohio State picks up a win against a Maryland team I'd rank 25. Impressed with that for sure. Michigan beat up on Minnesota, which, I'm still impressed with. I've just thought Ohio State's better the whole season. Ohio State's resume looks better at this point. Not really to the fault of Michigan. I mean, you can blame them for not scheduling tougher opponents, sure, but they're doing what they can with the schedule that they have now. Ohio State is just more impressive to me. That Notre Dame win still rings as a very solid for me. That Maryland win is very solid for me. And I just like what Ohio State's doing more. If we're talking about, draft prospects and all of that, I mean, sure, you can go Michigan, but at the end of the day, that doesn't matter. These teams want to win games. They don't, the head coaches, the, assistant coaches, the student body, the fans, they don't care where guys get drafted as much as they care about just winning the football games. I think Ohio State is doing that better, and they're more likely to win all of their games going forward, if I'm being honest. I just see more promise there. With that being said, I hate just talking bad about Michigan every time because I like Ohio State more. Obviously, bitter rivalry. Obviously, we both happen to be on the Ohio State side of this. But Michigan, really, really solid. I mean, they really have been on cruise control the whole season, and that's a lot easier said than done. Even teams like Georgia, who we both have ranked number 1, they've been putting it on cruise control and ran into some troubles. I mean, against teams that they shouldn't have, especially South Carolina. South Carolina may be better than a team like Minnesota, for example, but Michigan's just been hanging out, beating teams that are somewhat competitive and doing what they have to do. So a lot of credit there. Just in a head-to-head matchup, if it happened today, I would take Ohio State. So that's definitely a factor that puts them a spot higher for me.
Yeah, and number 1 overall, we have Georgia here. They went out and beat Kentucky. I know a lot of people, like I said last week, kind of had this was a big game for Georgia. Kentucky, a ranked matchup. A lot of people were calling for Georgia to be knocked off as the number 1 team. They went out, they won this game in a massive win. Brock Bowers, one point I want to bring up past AJ Green for now he's second in receiving touchdowns in Georgia history. I mean, this guy is one of the best prospects I've ever watched. I think if he as a freshman, I would say he was probably a first round pick. His freshman year, he was insane. He just keeps getting better every single year. He's coming up close to Terrence Edwards as the second. Terrence Edwards has 30 touchdowns. He has 24. Edwards played 4 years. Brock Bowers has only played 3 and is already at 24 receiving touchdowns overall as a tight end. And I mean, he's just insane overall. Had a massive game this week with 130 yards and a touchdown. Carson Beck figured it out. He hasn't been that great all year, but he's got it done. This game was a massive game for him against this Kentucky defense. He figured it out. And I mean, Georgia came out here, got the win. They do have some tough matchups towards the end of the season with Ole Miss and Tennessee, the 2 out of the last 3 games. But for now, they should be able to cruise through a bunch of these wins for the rest of the year.
Yeah, and I don't have much to add to that. Georgia was supposed to go out here and beat this Kentucky team pretty good. We both like Kentucky, obviously undefeated going into this game, but Georgia is just playing at another level. They are the best team in college football right now. I know they get a lot of flack for playing teams, as I mentioned, like South Carolina close, but they check all the boxes. If not Penn State, I think they have the best defense in the country. Brock Bowers is individually playing like the best player in college football right now. And outside of that, just incredible talent at each skill position. I think they're going to go in, and even as a Tennessee fan, I think they handle a team like Tennessee and a team like Ole Miss pretty easily. Those are both teams we have ranked in the top 20, so I think that's saying something. Georgia, very talented. If you want to pencil them in as an early national championship pick, I think it's a pretty good bet. So I'm not going to go against anything that you said there. I think Georgia looks great and will continue to look great.
Yeah, and this week, a lot of teams coming back from their bye week. We don't have too many massive matchups. Obviously, that Washington game going to be very big. USC and Notre Dame. Notre Dame's currently favored to win that game by 3. So very interesting. If you told me that at the beginning of the season, I thought that'd be a little interesting. But USC on the edge right now. They've been on the ropes, it seems like every single week with Caleb Williams, but a very big matchup this week between those two teams. Miami and UNC, another big game for UNC if they can get it done. Kentucky and Missouri, both teams towards the bottom of our rankings, but can still go out there and get a big win. And UCLA and Oregon State, another big game in the Pac-12. One of those teams definitely going to be knocking on the door of the top 10. So by the time we see you next week, we're going to have some different rankings. Obviously, that Washington-Oregon game, I think we could both agree whoever wins that game, definitely a top 5 spot next week. So we'll see you then.
See you guys.